The background of the COSMIC-311 study was to determine whether or not cabozantinib might have activity in patients who have already failed a prior VEGF receptor inhibitor for treatment of their RAI-refractory differentiated thyroid cancer. Historically, these patients had already been treated in the last 10 years with either lenvatinib, sorafenib, or sometimes other VEGF receptor inhibitors, lenvatinib and sorafenib being the two that are FDA approved. However, over time, patients develop progressive disease. So this was a high unmet need. The patients were then going to be randomized as a placebo-controlled trial to see whether or not cabozantinib could be used in this setting effectively to help control the patient's cancer. So the trial design actually allowed for two different primary endpoints. The first primary endpoint was the progression-free survival, and the other primary endpoint was the overall response rate of the first 100 patients following 6 months of treatment. Because of the design, there was a planned interim analysis at the time of the first 100 patients at 6 months of treatment. At that time, the Data Safety Monitoring Committee looked at the data, and the primary endpoint of progression-free survival had been met, where the hazard ratio was 0.22, and the progression-free survival of patients on the placebo arm was 1.9 months, and the progression-free survival of the patients who were on the treatment arm had not been reached. So this was meeting the primary endpoint of progression-free survival. The second primary endpoint, the overall response rate, was around 15%. The hazard ratio was 0.59, and this actually was not statistically significant. The p-value was 0.025, but that was not, as part of the statistical plan, considered statistically significant. So it did meet one of the two primary endpoints, and according to the study design, this meant that the patient met its primary endpoint and therefore was declared a positive trial. Due to the fact that it had reached its primary endpoint, the Data Safety Monitoring Committee felt that the future enrollment should be halted, and that was done, and patients were then followed from there. The future treatment of thyroid cancer depends on our having continued available effective therapies. And so by the results of this study, we've shown now that cabozantinib can be very effective in the setting of patients who've had a prior VEGF receptor inhibitor. Of note, 63% of these patients had prior lenvatinib. This is the first time that activity has been shown in a randomized controlled trial following treatment with lenvatinib. Most patients have had either lenvatinib or sorafenib or both prior to treatment. What's interesting about the placebo arm is it shows that these patients have very aggressive disease with a progression-free survival of only 1.9 months. That means that these patients badly need not only additional therapy, but they need to know what that therapy is going to be prior to actually having progression on their prior therapy. So it was important for us to actually identify this. So now we know that patients who have progressed on these agents, one, progress rapidly, and two, need another agent. And the results from the study have shown that cabozantinib can be this agent and would be active in this setting. One other final point is that the safety of cabozantinib was also documented in the study, and that the adverse events were not that different from previously identified adverse events with cabozantinib in other settings. So what we really see is that we have a response rate of 15% versus 0 in the placebo arm. We have a progression-free survival not met versus 1.9 months. And taken together between the safety and these two outcomes, I think it shows that cabozantinib really should be the next line treatment for patients with advanced thyroid cancer.